Welcome to our breakout room where we'll talk more about the great presentation that Cynthia and Kamala did. I thought I'd start off just by opening it up to what questions people had from the presentation. So please feel free to unmute and ask your question, or you can type it in the chat.
And while you're thinking of your question, I also want to, maybe you might have just a feeling about it, like a feeling of, wow, that there's just some ways that would be so challenging to try to do some of the work that we mentioned. So if that's coming up for you, that's fine too. Like just how, what's the challenge? What's the thing that feels like I can't do that? And we can kind of talk about it together. So
oh, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I have a concern. I really like your presentation, the approach that you did, like you as the teacher and the lead of the class, but I would like to know, I always thought I think, sorry, many ideas in my mind now, the school manager have to lead in some way these kind of subjects at the school. It's like the teacher is facing a very big subject, or it's something very substantial, and I think that requires also the support from the school, or the school have to send the same message, like in all environment. And it's a good start, we are teachers in our classroom, but I don't know, how do you deal with that, like all the organization and the teacher in the classroom?
I really don't have a lot of support from my school, other than the fact that they purchased the change agent. So it's something that I tackle. I did speak to a lot of teachers in my school, and we share materials. But for the most part, it's my learning community, and I'm allowed to tackle whatever subjects I feel it meets the needs of my students, so long as I'm also using it in a way that's going to, elevate the goals of the school, which is to get, gain and task diplomas.
Yeah, and I think so many of the things that you are teaching, like Kamala mentioned a bunch of them, like asking your students to point to evidence for why they think something, to back up, to first surface their opinions, but then say, well, so say more about why you think that and what evidence do you point to. That's a college and career readiness aligned skill, and you can kind of share with your program how what you're doing is forwarding and advancing those skills in the context of talking about racial equity. But I think you raise a good point. I mean, it may be that your program might not back you so much. And so that might be a component of something that you'll have to deal with.
What other questions or reflections do you have from the presentation? What stood out to you?
And feel free to put your video on if you want, so we can see who's here. And
so, Cynthia, you had done a webinar series for the New England practitioners where you talked about implicit bias and how, do you mind sharing a little bit about that? And Kamala, sharing if you find with your students, you ever find that they have conflicts with each other, that and how you handle that?
Yeah, the way I've been trying to talk with people about implicit bias is that we all have it, and it's universal. But we can address it and start to kind of recover from it by just raising our awareness about it. That's a huge step, and just bringing it into awareness. And so doing activities with your students where you uncover implicit bias is really instructive. And in that way of being a guide, as Kamala said, not an expert, we're doing this together. I'm uncovering my bias. We're doing this together and figuring it out together. Do you want to say more there, Kamala?
Definitely. I mean, you're going to encounter bias on a regular basis because that's human nature, that to have preferences. The idea is to cultivate the environment where when something is offensive, you kind of flip the script and make it relatable to that student who may be biased. One of the examples that I've used in the past and that I've encountered in the past is sometimes there's this struggle between some of the immigrant students and the students that are African American, because we have to understand that as a flawed society, different groups have always been pitted against one another. So by building on the idea that we have more commonalities than differences, and then how does it serve the powers that be to keep us divided? What causes do we have in common? So yeah, I do have to put some biases in check. There's a strong sense that it's okay to bash certain groups, and I'm always coming up against that. And I bring materials that are going to be from different perspectives, so it's going to elevate a viewpoint where someone may relate to that as being biased, because everyone has experienced bias. So once the student can relate to the fact that, well, that may seem to be okay, but what is the reality? What is the underpinnings of it? The example that I might use is that I've had some of my immigrant students, well, why do Black people commit so much crime? And how I address that is I'll bring to bear different resources so that you can understand why a community might be over-policed or maybe not have access to certain resources in terms of, was that really a crime, or were you just accused of a crime? And yes, there are certainly, criminals of all backgrounds. So, we have to take it apart. How does the media give that message? Are there really more, is drug abuse more criminalized for certain groups? So, once you kind of dismantle it, you'll find that there'll be a shift. But yes, they'll be biased and it'll be uncomfortable. But you have to face it head on.
I would like to just add something. I mean, that takes a lot of courage, Kamala, just to put yourself in a situation where your own students say to you, an African-American woman, why do Black people commit so much crime? I mean, you're setting up the classroom as such that you're going to receive this kind of racist perspective from a student, and you're going to be able to hold that and keep moving forward and, do your approach, which I think is great. Let's look this up. Let's do some research and let's see what's actually true. Let's look at the data. So I think that's great. And I mean, I think a question I have for you is, where do you get that courage? Where do you get the support? One thing I say a lot in my webinars is don't try to do this alone. You need to have a little group that you can check in with and talk to and get support from to be able to do this. How do you do it?
Just keep pushing, I have faith in humanity. And I know that we're all coming from backgrounds where you've been taught, untruths. So it's about addressing it and questioning it. And yeah, I mean, just today, we were talking about what changes can be made to society. Oh, that was the other day. And my student was like, well, we need to, bring back the gang units and bring back stop and frisk. It's when it sometimes can go against my beliefs. it's difficult to kind of bite my tongue. I said, well, maybe we need to look at the statistics and see, you know, I mean, we've got to dig and say, well, why do you believe that? You know, did you get that from the television? Let's look at some resources. So you better believe I'm going to be looking at some resources to bring to that conversation.
Yeah, I see a hand up from Ahuva. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that the census statistics are very useful, and all kinds of local New York City statistics that, you know, you can do graphic illustrations of and show people. That's what they're studying anyway, is, you know, graphs and charts and so on. But that really helps you lay it out without having to say so, but have people actually discover the truth instead of telling them what it is.
Wonderful. Phil, do you want to say something?
Well, I really appreciated the part where Kamala was telling us of creating a safe space in the classroom. I lived 14 years in the Dominican Republic and 6 years in Haiti. And I was an English teacher, but I was also working on agricultural projects there. But personally, myself, after about 3 or 4 years of living in each of those countries, after about 3 or 4 years without leaving the countries, I began to feel emotionally constricted in myself. And like I had breathing attacks, I couldn't breathe. And I had to return to the United States because I was having these panic attacks. And it came to me that I wasn't conscious of my own need to create a safe space for my own self that would reflect who I am as a person from the Midwest in this country, and a farm boy. And the culture, I love the culture. My wife is from Haiti, but at the same time, I was facing where my own implicit biases of who I was as a person, I needed to find a safe space to even be able to address those, because that was impinging on my ability to be emotionally well and healthy. I had negative implicit biases against the cultures of the Dominican Republic and Haiti both. And those negative biases weren't good for me, and they weren't good for the country I was living, against the people I was living in either. Right. But I had to come to a place where I could breathe back in my own country to be able to have the strength, internal strength, to address those biases.
Interesting. I mean, that really gives a lot of perspective about how it feels to be an immigrant.
So by you creating a safe space for the students in your room, that's so important as a role as a teacher. You know, that my wife attended ESOL classes here in this country, and she was grateful for the safe space that her teacher created for her to write journals, you know, and things like that. The journals she had with her teacher was something that was something that I couldn't even provide to her, to my wife as a spouse. And so that's where, even though your students might have family support, the teacher support is kind of really important, because it's in addition to that. So thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, it takes work. It's not something that happens organically. It's constantly challenged. So, you know, I've had to say, you know, we don't tolerate
Yeah.
you know, bias that's hurtful. I've had issues with, you know, where you have, you know, certain people who have certain values that are more Christian based, and they're at odds with some of my students who are women with wives, and we've had to, you know, come to some common ground you know, that may not be for you and that your doctrine may not approve that, but we understand that, you know, in America, it's important. That's why we're here, that people are given certain freedoms, and, you know, we have to respect those choices. And, you know, you'll find that once there's more sharing, you know, it's the not knowing that, and what you grab from the media or from your personal background that can really feed into the bias, but you can break it down. And it's not always, you know, something that will happen overnight. It's definitely something I'm still working on, in finding strategies that are going to be effective. In fact, I think there's a lovely, I hate to be a whole change agent fan here, but that's my fan.
Oh, go
club.
ahead.
There's a really nice slideshow I'm remembering now on I believe that, no, maybe that wasn't change agent. Oh gosh, I'm gonna have to find that. But it went down what do all the, you know, acronyms mean, and, you know, just discussing, you know, different types of families. And I find that, you know, some of the students who I thought were going to be very resistant were open. So, you know, you never know when you're going to, you know, strike a chord. You just have to keep trying. And yeah, I don't know where I get the perseverance. I just keep trying. Sometimes I fail. But, you know, you can learn from those failures. Well, that did not work. Let me try something else. And I love what Miss Pearson was saying, you know, try different media tools. You know, sometimes it'll be a cartoon. Sometimes it'll be, you know, a commercial. You know, does that make sense? That sounds like, you know, faulty persuasion there. So, you know, just grab whatever you can. Keep pushing.
Does anybody else want to share a story of maybe trying to do this in their classroom, or a concern about raising it in the classroom?
Yeah, if I may. So I used to teach indigenous people from Mexico in Seoul, and they started teaching me Spanish. Spanish was the most used language in the classroom. And it took me a while to understand that the other half of the class speaks an indigenous language, and I got very interested in their culture. So that even proved to me how much I assumed that, okay, Latin America is kind of homogenous, that, you know, if you speak Spanish. So I had to do a lot of reflection and a lot of talking with the center director, who was indigenous, and I would talk to her almost every time after my classes. But I also heard that they were calling me the white teacher. So I was surprised, and I got hurt. And then I talked first to the center director instead of asking the question in the class. She explained that actually they meant it in a positive way, that she had ESOL teaching background, and they didn't want her to teach, but they wanted me to teach. And so and I decided to not address this issue in the classroom, because I was told that they have a different way of seeing the world. And right, I come from a Western culture, and how important it is to recognize the diverse perspectives and not take it personal. But we did talk about race in general and how race is negotiated in the United States. However, after this episode, I started reading more about race in Mexico and how indigenous groups are mistreated. And so it's a much more complex issue. And for the 3 years that I was there, I decided to not, I mean, I addressed it, but not confront it, rather than I acknowledged in class that I am not from the US. I don't know the historical aspects. And I asked them to talk more about the historical aspect of racial issues in Mexico, which again, they were not comfortable because they had Mexicans in the class. So as you said, Philip, it is a very complex topic to address. And sometimes, you know, although I wanted to create a safe class space, and I thought I did, but because of the power dynamic among the students themselves, it just didn't get explored as deeply as I wanted it. So that was just an interesting experience that I had.
Mm.
Where was your class, Andrea?
I was teaching in Tampa, and yeah.
I think you did a lot of interesting things there, just listening to you. You educated yourself about your students and where they're from. That's great. You were referred to as a white teacher, and that made you feel a certain kind of way. You brought that up with your director, and you got some help processing that and thinking about it. Like, these are all great tools to use if you're doing this work. You paused, you slowed down, you took your time, it doesn't, you might not feel like you had a ringing success in terms of getting your students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to talk. I mean, but that's okay. You did a lot there. You did a lot. Yeah. Congratulations. Does anybody else have a story? We probably have time for a couple more if you want to share something.
I was interested in exploring how you teach people to defend themselves, or to demand the space to speak up in a situation where they're closed out. Like, beyond just looking at racism and being excluded, how do people demand that they be included? That's more interesting to me.
I can share one experience. Sorry, I don't want to hijack the discussion, but what I did quickly, we created a mural at that community center, and I encouraged my students to use the Indigenous languages and Spanish and English. But I encouraged, I didn't say what the mural should be about. We just explored, like, what are your goals here in the United States? And so the mural was in 3 languages, but also it allowed them to understand that they have similar goals. All of my students actually were undocumented. So when you see a simple image with a car, I'm like, what's up with that? I learned a lot about their daily struggles, and they also understood that they are all the same, that they have similar circumstances, and they come from the same country. They might have the differences in cultures, but that they have similar goals. And I think that this led to an understanding of, I guess, being respectful in the classroom. So hopefully that answers your question.
I think that the students who, like you said, were undocumented, but not just the fact that they were undocumented, there are so many other emotional factors that play upon an immigrant in this country. And after a number of years, it builds up internally in them. And the fact that you can open up a space for these immigrant students who are, who are facing so many negative aspects of life in the United States, that it certainly is a great relief to have some release for expression of who we are.
That's what they reported me after I asked them about the mural, that it was a stress relief for them, which was interesting. Sorry, Kamala.
No, I was just sharing, when we were in remote learning, I had done an activity that had really surprising effects that I wanted to share. And it's an activity where each student kind of can bring something meaningful to share with the group. And, you know, I had given it as like a homework so that they could come in and bring it the next day. So they had time to think about it. And it was so nice that the sharing, because we're a diverse group, where some people shared a photograph of, you know, of a family member, or, you know, that they shared. Another person shared a, you know, a carving that they had brought with them from Gambia, and another person, you know, shared some, you know, embroidery that had come from her country. And so I think that sometimes when we're thinking about very lofty concepts, but just the simpler items of sharing things that are meaningful can kind of break down some of those biases, where, oh, I thought you were like this, or I thought that group was like that, or oh, you know, you know, keep at it. I feel for you, that the struggle of
Kamala, keep your voice pointed right dead center to the mic.
oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Just keep dead center, then we hear you better.
Okay.
Yeah.
I lost my chain of thought. But there is a lot of you know, pushback, you know, between the different groups, and especially in this country, in terms of my Mexican American students. So I just take the approach where I just, you know, make a concerted effort to teach a history lesson early on that shows a map of, you know, Mexico. And where was Mexico? It was all the way up by Colorado and Arizona. So, you know, all of these notions of like, well, you need to go home. Well, guess what? You know,
They're already home.
I am home, you know, and so that we can understand that there's inequalities here, where someone is not home in their own home. Yeah, so you need to just keep confronting the bias. Just keep chipping away.
Great. Well, we have just about 1 more minute left. Are there any other questions or experiences that you'd like to share before we wrap up? So I'd just like to thank all of you and our presenters, Kamala and Cynthia, for taking the time to talk about such an important issue, for all the work you're doing with your adult learners around this topic, and creating safe spaces for them. We hope to see you next February the 11th, where we'll be talking about digital skills for educators. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Destiny.